Everything is in its place. The flour is sifted, the ingredients are carefully measured. It's time for the baker to begin preparing the bread. The flour and water are mixed together as the baker incorporates the yeast. The baker's hands are warm and soft as they begin to knead. Much in the same way as the baker prepares bread for the table, the season of Lent is a time for us to prepare our hearts. During Lent, we remember the death of Jesus Christ and prepare for the celebration of his resurrection. We make space for new growth and transformation in our lives. In this season of Lent, we will be looking at the last words of Jesus on the cross. These words reveal the Father's heart, the depth of Jesus' suffering, and the transformative work of the Holy Spirit. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home.
Four years ago, she needed a home. 3 years prior, she entered the world. And while I wasn't there for her arrival, the moment I saw her blue eyes, she had my heart. From that time on, she became my daughter, and she was home. 48 years. 48 years ago, I needed a home. As summer ended, I entered the world. And while I don't remember my arrival, that moment changed everything as they opened their hearts. From that time on, I was their son, and I was home. 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, she needed a home. 33 years prior, he entered the world. And while we still celebrate his arrival, he was her firstborn, and his death broke her heart. From that time on, another became her son, and she was home. Future years. In future years, we'll need a home. With great expectation, we'll leave this world. And while angels sing at our arrival, the moment we see his eyes and feel the love in his heart, we will know for all time we are sons, we are daughters, we are home.
Hi, my name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here at the meeting place. Hi. So right now, while you and I are here, our high school students and their leaders are at a thing called Soar Heartland, which is this incredible missions opportunity during spring break. So sometime this last week, these students would have each sat in their rooms, had their suitcase on their bed, and decided what it is that they were going to pack to be able to prepare for this particular adventure that they were going to be on. So I'm sure their favorite pillow went in. How many clothes do you need for 10 days? They would have tried to figure that out. They might have looked over at the stuffed animals in the corner and decided how many of those needed to come along. But bottom line is, they would have decided what it is they needed in order for them to be able to participate in this thing called Soar Heartlands. For those of you that travel, some of you I know travel extensively for business, you're used to this practice of knowing that there's only so much you can get into a suitcase when you're flying in particular, and if you don't like to bother with baggage claim, then you'll try to figure out how to get everything that you need into stuff that you can carry onto the plane. So this idea of being very discerning about what resources you need to be able to accomplish this next project that you're about is something that we're familiar with. Where I encounter this often is in this little thing called the 3 Red Canoes, which is a group of people that I've been canoeing with for many years now, we get together in spring and talk about our summer plans. And so we did meet again at the beginning of this March, and we made some plans together as to what we were going to do this summer. One of the things that's part of our planning is this. Because we're traveling in canoes, there's only so much room after you put the people in it. And there's some things that we have, of course, privately, personally, which is our personal backpack. But then there are some things that we share in common, like shelter. And one of the other things we bring along is a food barrel. This food barrel is designed to carry all of the food for our trip. And if we get to a campsite where it looks like there might be some evidence of bears, or maybe the potential for bears exists, then we could take this food barrel, and tie it up in a tree to make sure that we don't actually attract a bear to our campsites. Well, you can imagine, if you put the food for a multi-day canoe trip into a food barrel, it gets pretty disorganized in this food barrel, and it's hard to find out what goes with which meal and how to sort that all out. So what we've done is we've introduced containers like this. Now, if you can believe this container must contain all of the food for, if there's 7 of us, if it's a full complement, for 7 people for a meal. So what happens is in March, when we just talked, we gave these out. Everybody took their particular container home, and they were assigned a particular meal, and we talked about our menu preferences. And so their job now is, when we get together in summer, to bring this container with them, and it will be 1 meal for the number of people we're going to be for this canoe trip. So this is about counting the cost. It's about deciding how much can go in here, because I realize if we go to the food pack when the time comes for a meal, and we reach in and we pull out this container, and let's say we eat all of this food and we decide we're probably a little bit more hungry, and we reach for the next container, now what we've done is we've compromised on the next meal. So we need to be very discerning in how it is that we distribute our resources. We are in a series called Under New Management, exploring how it is that you and I navigate the world of the resources that we are entrusted with, and how do we invest these wisely. Today we're looking at a particular theme, which is get on a budget. This idea that we would in fact become discerning in how we actually distribute our resources. So where do we get some information about this? Well, Jesus, in his teaching, often uses illustrations that involve finances. In this particular instance, he's traveling with a group of people. They're on their way to Jerusalem, and he offers these 2 illustrations. Here's the first one. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. I imagine that he uses this illustration because Jesus, having been raised a carpenter's son, was essentially apprenticed to a carpenter, would have had experience with construction sites. Is it possible that perhaps he and his dad loaded up their cart with all of the timber that they needed and grabbed all their hand tools and arrived at a certain site to be able to build the columns and the beams and the joists and the rafters and roof decking, whatever was required, and discovered that the owner of the project, the person that wanted to build this particular building, no longer had the resources to be able to afford their work? And did they have to haul everything back to the shop? We're not sure. But surely this idea that we don't start a project, we don't invest, we don't give ourselves into an adventure without knowing what the actual resources are that are required to accomplish the mission. Here's a second illustration. This, I think, comes from the news of Jesus' day. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. This was the reality of the nation of Israel. When the Roman Empire rolled in, they really didn't have the resources to offer any extensive resistance at all. In fact, they pretty well had to roll over and say, okay, you're bigger, you're stronger, we need to come to some terms. And so they arranged some terms. We know there's a king in Israel, but we know that he was subject to the authority of the Romans. It's possible that during Jesus' time, and we should be clear that he spent his entire time in the nation of Israel as he walked along those roads, and as he conducted his ministry there, he had spent his entire time here on earth under the rule of this Roman Empire. And so is it possible that news trickled in from other places where the Romans were conquering new territory and adding new nations to the empire in its entirety? And so this would have been very real for Jesus. And he offers these words to his audience of the day. And today we look at these things and we realize that there is a truth contained within them. This very simple idea that we need to be careful with the resources that we have. And before we decide to act on something, we need to make sure that we have what we need to do what we hope to accomplish. So let's get really practical. Our first order of business, if we're going to deal with our finances in particular, is to check out what is our total income. Now, our income comes from a number of sources. For some, it's salaries. For others, it's perhaps government support. There's all kinds of checks that we may get, GST refunds, and who knows what all may come your way. For some of us, we work in a field, let's say you're working in sales, and you realize your income is dependent on what it is that you're able to sell because your income is based on commission. Others of you may work in restaurants and you rely on tips to make ends meet. But whatever your source of income is, our first course of action is to write down, let's say for a month, what is my total income? What is the resource that's available to me in the first place? And this is how it begins. Then our second course of action is to look at our expenses. And we have the gift of knowing that our expenses fall into some very specific categories. And if you're interested in exploring this in particular, I certainly would encourage you to do so. We have a resource that's available at the Info Center. This is created by a person within our faith community for our use in particular. On page 78 in this book, there is a breakdown of the way we could manage our expenses into these 5 categories. So pick this up to help you with that. We have 5 categories that are represented for us on this table with these water bottles. Now, there are 20 water bottles here. So if this represents 100% of our income, then assign about 5% to each bottle to work with. Our first category is giving. We know that in the Old Testament, when God first called the nation of Israel to become a people, he gave them an instruction about a tithe, a 10% that they should set aside. And he was very clear from the very beginning to say the 10% is really a baseline. There should be more generosity. There's other opportunity for you to contribute. So it's represented in this scenario as 15%. Jesus confirms the practice of the tithe in the New Testament in a comment to a bunch of leaders of the day when he says to them, don't neglect to continue to practice this, but also notice that there is new opportunity for you to be generous. This is part of what our spending should look like. Then we get to the blue water bottles. They represent savings. And I'm not sure if your parents perhaps told you this, but the idea is we set aside about 10% of our income for savings, for that rainy day, for that day when some things go off the rails and we need the resources to be able to overcome perhaps a time of struggle. Now, we know from the stats that the average Canadian these days is saving about 1%, which is vastly different than the 10% target as laid out in this scenario. Then we get to the green, which is our need category. I think it's important and powerful for us to realize that you and I have needs, and we shouldn't feel bad about the fact that we have needs. In fact, we should realize that there are some things that are part of our existence which are obligations that we must own as people. One of them is a mortgage. Maybe you don't have a mortgage. Maybe you pay rent in an apartment. Maybe you have a room and board arrangement with somebody. Whatever it may be, there is shelter that we need to look after. There might be a car payment in this category. Now, some of you don't drive cars, so you use public transportation. That's an expense that can go in here. Some of you don't use cars or public transportation, but you prefer to use a bike, which terrifies us. Right? I know the enthusiasm. I always think courageous souls that do this year-round, but at the same time, I do know that my heartbeat goes up a little bit when a bike rider is near the vehicle that I'm driving. So I want you to invest some serious money in a really good helmet. And I want you to make sure that you've got the blinking lights both at the front and the back to make sure that you're visible. And of course, you have other expenses with a bike. There's flat tires and oil and things like that you need to keep the thing up. So bottom line is there is a category in our expenses which is about needs. And then we have this fun little category, our wants. This is not stuff that you need. This is stuff that you want. Like, for example, taking a macrame class at the local community college, or something else along those lines. It's something that you choose to include because You're curious about something. You want to pick up a new hobby. You want to do whatever. Maybe you have something that you need some resources in order to live. I don't want us to feel bad about this category. I want us to recognize that this is a category that has legitimacy in our life. Right? God has created an incredible world for us to live in. He's created it beautifully. He's created it in such a way that we're really invited to enjoy what He's created for us to enjoy. And so for us to have a category like this, it makes a lot of sense. Now, you'll notice that in this scenario, the debt category is empty. And before we start talking about that, I'd like you to watch this little video. Now, you and I laugh at this, right? Because, of course, it is hilarious. At the same time, it does represent the reality. You and I live in a world where the opportunity to buy something is everywhere. And the notion of buying something before you have the resources for it is also common practice. That's the difference between traveling in places where there's civilization and like canoe trips. On canoe trips, if I want more stuff, I can look in the food barrel all I want. There isn't going to be more food. The only other resource I have available to me are the woods. I can go find some firewood, and maybe I can spot some blueberries. But that's about the only way I can add additional resources. But in the world that you and I live in, even if you're on a business trip, if you see something that you want to buy, you can buy it because, of course, you have access to resources that you haven't yet earned. This is how this impacts our budget. We've decided that there's a limited number of resources. We've distributed them. Well, now what happens if we introduce debt? Well, for sure, the macrame classes go by the wayside because they're not that important. They don't put food on the table. The idea of saving is really challenged, so we feel the weight of the debt because we have to service that first. But here's what also happens is we become less generous in our thinking. We certainly start thinking about the fact that maybe this isn't a good time for us to think about others. We need to be about the thing that's an immediate concern in front of us. And so what happens is our budgets, these first four numbers, are influenced by the kind of debt that we carry. And you understand how very quickly it can start putting pressure points on some of these other things. So here's the way this calculation works. You look at your income, and then you look at your expenses, and this is how it turns out. Subtract the expenses from the income, and guess what? It should always equal 0. If you discover that at the end of your budget preparation, you still have money left that isn't assigned, well, guess what? You're in the enviable position to decide where else to put some money. You can build up one of these other categories. If you come to the end of your budget deliberations, when you've looked at your total income, now you're looking at your expenses and they exceed what your income is, unless you do something, unless you go back to the categories and start shaving back and pulling back a little bit on them, your plan is to be in more debt a year from now than you are today. It's a very simple process. There are only so many resources available to us, and we need to be responsible for them. So the way to do this, to make sure that you're actually on top of it, you must do the following. You have to track your spending. Because our natural habits aren't going to lead us towards what our goals are. We have to be deliberate about that. We actually have to look at the way we manage our money and, in fact, keep track at the end of a month to look and see, have I spent as much money in this category as I'd hoped? Have I overspent? Have I underspent? What adjustments do I need to make? And so this is how we place ourselves under new management. If this is something where maybe this is a new idea, then I would encourage you to consider what would it look like if you actually go through the practice of processing your finances through this lens. Take your total income, your total expenses, work it out. How is it that you want to spend your money? Because in many ways, as much as there are some categories in which you don't have any options, you do have decision-making power. If a business puts the sign up on the outside of the store that says, under new management, this business is serious to say, whatever we had in place beforehand is not sufficient. We had to make a change. New management was required in order for us to correct the thing that needed to be corrected. Are you and I prepared to place ourselves under new management, to actually explore what are our true values? What is the thing we really want to accomplish? Are we aligning the resources that have been entrusted to us in a way that actually follows what our hoped for outcomes are? Good lesson. However, there's one thing we need to be honest about. When Jesus gave us the two illustrations, on the side of the road traveling to Jerusalem, to that particular audience of the day, he was not inspired in a moment of great insight to deliver a workshop on finances. This was not his primary point. These illustrations clearly give us a sense of his understanding that certain resources are required for us to be able to accomplish certain things. We must count the cost. But the cost that he wants his audience in that moment to count, the cost that I think he's asking us to count, is of much greater significance. Here is the last verse of this text unit. In the same way, so based on those two illustrations, the one about the building site, the other one about the military warfare, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Now imagine, you're traveling along with Jesus. You're excited because here is a leader who's embodying a compassion. He's speaking about themes like forgiveness and love and grace. He's speaking about things that give you a hope for the future, and you don't want to miss a moment. You want to be part of this throng of people. You want to be present when the next great things comes out of his mouth because you don't want to miss out. So what happens? Jesus is looking around. He's seeing all these people walking with him. What happens? Well, Jesus knows he's heading to Jerusalem. He knows that he's going to face an arrest there. He knows that he will be flogged, and he knows that he will be crucified. And so his heart breaks for the people that are with him. He can't stand the idea that somehow they have the notion that they're joining something that is just about the great things of life, and this is something that is about enjoyment and the pleasure of things, and it's about the hope. And he wants to make sure that they understand that alongside traveling with him and pursuing this particular act or project of reconciliation that Jesus is about is going to cost them things that perhaps they're not thinking about today. And he's saying to them, make sure you count the cost, because following me is going to require you to put everything under new management. It's not just about your finances. The decisions you make about how you want to engage in my project will influence your finances, but it doesn't just stop with our money. The question to you and I is not just about, do we want to place our financial world under new management, but do we want to place our entire life under new management? That's the question he asked of the followers that day. How many of them do you think in that moment were sobered and thought to themselves, this is too big of an ask. Maybe I won't continue this journey. So let's get really practical again. A number of years ago, I was entrusted with this incredible gift. I received a birthday card from Brian, our family life pastor. It was the occasion of my 50th birthday. He gave me the gift of titling the birthday card Bob 5.0, which I liked. It gave me a sense about my operating system. It made me think about it. And so at the time, I was inspired enough by this concept that I sat down and I wrote down 5 categories, 5 points, and here they are. And I decided I was going to write a statement about each of these 5, and this would be essentially the definition of the marching orders that I want to be about. This is how I would spend my life. And I put these on the front of a clipboard, and this is my daily clipboard. This sits on my desk all the time. And some of you are judging me right now because this is old school. But here's the thing. You don't live in a paperless world, and I don't live in a paperless world. So at this point, there are still documents that come across my desk, and until I decide what action to take or where they need to be filed, they go into this clipboard. And on the front of this clipboard are these 5 statements. So I have this visual reminder for me all the time. What is it that I want to be about? The first one is about Jesus. And it says this: see things as Jesus sees them. I want my heart to break for what breaks his. If he's about reconciliation, I want to be about reconciliation. If he's about extending forgiveness that exceeds our human imagination, then that's what I want to be about. I want to see this world like Jesus sees it. That's my first opening premise. That's under new management. He will decide. And then I have a statement about my wife, Hildy. Who's the primary relationship in your world that you want to name? And then I have a statement about my family. And then I have a statement about my work. Notice the order, by the way. And then the fifth one is about my leisure time. By now, it says Bob 5.5, right? Because my operating system has been upgraded 5 times since I was 5.0. Every birthday, I revisit this list, and I change some things. My current one about leisure says this: I want to embrace a generous life of curiosity with a strong body and a creative soul to make beautiful things. I stay active because I don't want to get flabby. Right? The six-pack turns into a keg. I want to be curious because it's one of the greatest callings. I think God is curious about us. I want to be curious about the world He's created for us. I want to be able to express creativity. It feeds my soul. And if I'm going to put my hand to anything, I want it to be beautiful. I will not settle for less. I'm inviting you to consider the opportunity for you to place yourself under new management. Perhaps these 5 categories will be helpful to you. Maybe you want to use more. I'm not sure what's going to happen when I turn 6-0, because then I have to find another statement. I'm not sure. The point, though, is you and I are invited by Jesus. We're cautioned by Jesus to make sure that we understand the cost. And yet at the same time, He extends to us an invitation to say, do you really want to settle for a life that isn't full of the most purposeful way of living? Come place yourself under my management, Jesus asks, and experience the extraordinary. It's going to be hard sometimes, but it's also going to be grand. Consider the question.
So, thank you for sharing. Thank you for your teach. I'll just read directly from one of the texts that says, "Thank you, Pastor Bob, for this reminder about using our resources responsibly." Part 2 of that text. "There are some for whom the ship has sailed, and they are mired in payments. So what now?"
Go to the TMP app and find last week's teach, where Paul, I think, gave us some very practical solutions about what to do with debt. But I would say to you for sure, if you find that you're in circumstances where this is overwhelming, we are a faith community that is available to each other, not only in the good times, but also when things are tough. And so take the courage, call the office, talk to Paul, and he will set you up with a person that will probably come to your home and sit with you and say, let's walk through your finances, and they will give you the best advice that they can. Now, understand that this is not professional advice. This is the advice of somebody who's familiar with the world of finance. At the end of the day, you still need to speak with your bank and other institutions to sort this out. But the idea is that there are people who can look at your numbers and give you some really good advice about what next steps to take. The idea of not living under the weight of debt, if you can imagine what that might feel like, you know how much freedom there would be in that for you, and there are ways to get there. So that would be my suggestion now.
Okay, thank you. Next question. We are immersed in a culture of spending and credit cards. If I don't keep up with my peers and go out for food and buy new stuff, it feels like I'm going to be left behind, or that I might lose my friendship circles. How do I respond when faced with the peer pressure of spending?
Yeah. You know what I would say? I would say, as much as it may require something of you, just be upfront about it. To say, I've decided to look at the way I manage my resources in a more responsible way. I've decided on a new set of values, and so this thing that we're looking at potentially doing doesn't fit into that picture. I wouldn't be surprised if it's true that the stats are what they are, that the average Canadian, in fact, has over $22,000 in debt. People that fall into my age category have $34,000 in debt. I wouldn't be surprised if the people around you in some ways would see this as a prompt where they suddenly go, here's a person who's actually taking a courageous stand in a world that's very much about spending, and they are not spending. Here's a person who's deciding to be decidedly countercultural. In fact, I believe that this is part of the calling that Jesus has for us, to place ourselves under new management. Will we, in fact, adjust our values to reflect more closely what he would hope for us?
Absolutely. If I can respond in conversation. I have been privileged to have a few friends where we've had conversations like that, where there's been a suggestion to go out, and then a person in the circle has said, you know what, it's just not in the cards for us this month. We've hit our budget limit. And they're like, can we go to someone's house? Can we go to someone's house and can we make it a potluck and make food and share together? And the way that statement frees people in the circle to respond in kind in another situation, or to really acknowledge what's happening, is that we want to spend time together. It doesn't matter where that happens. It's hard to be the first person to do that, but if you can do that amongst your peers, it's a step in that direction.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got one more. So if I am already in debt, where is my first priority? Giving to the church or getting rid of the debt?
Yes, so I realize I'm one of your pastors, so I feel obligated to share with you that, of course, this faith community, relies on, and in fact is totally dependent upon the resources that we collect in this faith community. There is no other source of income for the church. It literally comes out of my wallet and yours, and this is the thing that we do together. So for you to look at your budget and decide, yes, I need to address the debt. This thing is just too big. I can't ignore it. I have to do something about it. Is a very responsible thing to do. I would recommend to you that what you do is on the giving category, practice giving perhaps in a small way. Continue a giving practice. Maybe it's not the target that you're hoping to reach. Maybe it's not the 10% that the Old Testament suggests or the more than 10% that Jesus refers to. Maybe it's just a portion, but for you to keep the practice and the discipline of continuing to be other-minded in the way you spend your resources is an incredibly mature way to engage it. Because then what happens is when more money becomes available to you, when you find yourself on the other side of this hurdle that you're trying to clear, the practice is already in place. I don't know about you, but when I think about my own history in finances, when I think when Hildy and I were first married and how little we had and how we made it work, you would think that today our needs wouldn't have changed very much and we'd be able to spend so much more money because clearly our earning power has increased significantly. What do? All of the categories stretch the more income we receive. And so in order for us to have the discipline of practicing a generosity mindset, even when things are difficult for us, I think it's a better way to go rather than saying, let's take away this category altogether for a time. So make it something that doesn't cause you to be burdened or experience harm in it. Make it sacrificial, but do it in such a way that it retains, it's part of your rhythm of how you invest your resources. That would be my thought about that.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Carmen.
Thank you for sharing with us this morning. There are often many questions that come up out of a conversation like this, so we'll address as many as we can, and bear with us. Question number 1. What happens if I have a clear budget and emergency expense comes up that my income can't cover? Thought I'd start with a slow ball.
Yeah, of course. The reality is that there have been moments in all of our lives where I think for us to incur debt is in fact the only option that's available to us. And in that moment, we realize that in order to serve this debt, we will have to make an adjustment in our budget. So debt in itself isn't meant to be avoided when a situation like that comes up, but then for us to be very deliberate. And in fact, if we've managed our resources well up to that point, this debt won't necessarily throw us for too far, for too long off track. But yes, the truth of the matter is there are moments where you have no other option. And perhaps you can't turn to family and so on like that. So for you to incur debt, but to be responsible in the way to do that, I think it's a possibility that you have to be aware of.
Well, and hopefully if we've also been saving, there are ways that we can kind of cushion it or to talk to other people, right? So this question actually came up in the first service, but I'm going to then ask it again. So there are some for whom the ship has sailed and we are mired in payments for debt. So now what?
Well, very practical. Get the app. Seriously.
If you have a phone, if you have to buy a phone to get the app, don't do that.
Good caution. No, go to our teaching series, this current series. Last Sunday, Paul spoke about how to respond to debt. And so there is, in fact, a teach available to you that gives you very practical ways of actually addressing the debt. And so you can get there by app, or of course you can go to our website and find your way there. But yeah, debt has been addressed really well by Paul, so go there and find some very practical solutions.
Yes, I'm not going to keep answering. That's good. Sorry, I had it right there. It seems like living by a budget might foster a mentality of self-dependence as opposed to Jesus dependence. Can you comment on how we might avoid this pitfall while still being responsible with what God has given us?
Right. This is something that comes up all the time, this idea that we live by faith. So in other words, what happens is we've interpreted that living by faith means chaos. It means that we don't take responsibility, but we literally believe that he will always rescue us, or he will just always just somehow intervene. If we look at Scripture, it is true that many of the Bible stories that are contained within Scripture speak to us about that kind of intervention, that God, in fact, reveals himself to people in very dramatic circumstances. But we must be aware that these stories have a bias towards what I would call supernatural revelation, where God shows up in very unexpected circumstances that we should not expect in our common circumstances. He's not going to be that dramatic in his response. That's not the way Scripture, in fact, describes it to us. And so for us to realize that to live by faith actually also means that I will trust that he has given me the intelligence to be deliberate and be responsible in assigning my budget the way I do. So that is actually living faithfully, because I'm receiving the resource of being responsible for the resources I've received in that way. Are there times when our life circumstances, let's say we go back to the first question, something happens, and we turn to God and we say, we cannot find our way, and we pray and we say, I'm just going to ask for a miracle, and a miracle could occur? Absolutely. You should always allow for that. But for us to use a crass illustration, you don't throw yourself in traffic hoping that God will rescue you. Right? That's irresponsible. There's ways that we can own our parts, and it doesn't mean that he's not part of the picture.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, next question. We are immersed in a culture of spending and credit cards. If I don't keep up with my peers and go out for food or buy new stuff, it feels like I'm going to be left behind, or perhaps worse, lose my friendship circles. So how do I respond when faced with peer pressure of spending?
Okay, my friends, the reality is, the stats tell us that the average Canadian has about $22,000 in debt. My age category has over $34,000 in consumer debt. I would encourage the person that wrote in this question, take a stand. If these are in fact your friends, turn to them and say, listen, I have reviewed our financial circumstances, and we've decided we're going to live differently. We've assigned a new set of values, and so we can't go out. It's not in our budget this year. And instead of receiving judgment, I suspect, maybe it won't be very vocal, but I suspect that some of your friends may actually appreciate you taking such a step, because they find themselves in a similar circumstance, and they're suddenly discovering the relief in knowing we don't have to do this thing out of obligation or the sense of trying to keep up with our neighbors, but we can actually all say to ourselves, you know what? You're right. We should all be more responsible. I suspect that could be the outcome of that. So don't be afraid.
If I can echo that, Bob,
Please.
I have been in a similar circumstance and have had a privilege of being in relationship with people for whom have set this example. And we've been in a group conversation, and there's been a suggestion to go out for food, and then someone else has said, it's just not in the cards. Like, we're at day 29 of the month, and it's not in the cards for us. And it has been so humbling to see the response of the circle, and empowering to us to speak like that with each other more consistently and say, well, let's have a potluck, because the point is for us to spend together, not to go out and spend money elsewhere. And then we get to enjoy good cooking from each other, or perhaps a bowl of cereal and milk. That works too. But if we can encourage you to be brave in those conversations. It's not easy to be vulnerable, but it is possible.
Yeah. Very good.
Okay. I think that's it for us this morning. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thanks, Carmen. So the question, remains for us to consider. This under a new management isn't just a cutesy title. It requires something of us. I invite you to consider the decisions that you need to make to consider new management. And if you have placed your life under new management and you're experiencing the freedom and the joy of that, bless you for that. And for those of you for whom this is a new concept, new idea, know that we're part of a faith community where we're walking this road together. There are others who are making the same very determined decisions to place themselves under new management. So if you'd like, there will be people at the front of the stage prepared to pray with you, not only about this, about anything that may come up. But in the meantime, be blessed. Enjoy life. We'll see you next Sunday.